So firstly, for me, when we think of inclusion, I think we often think about inclusion as being a bringing in, a fitting in or an assimilating of all, yes, in line with their needs and identity and diversity, but we think about it as a bringing in, whereas we should be thinking firstly about a pushing out. So rather than bringing a child forward to be included, we should be pushing the space out for that child. So in terms of form, in terms of function, and also in terms of affordance, so that not only it fits the child, but it actually has space and flex around the child.
In relation to open learning environments, my observation has been that enabling these environments to be quite flexible in their use is critical, that the placement of breakout spaces where there's a reduced level of distraction is imperative. It's a balance of being able to keep an eye on the kids, but also to ensure that you can neatly close off a breakout space or a student with some requirements where they find it difficult to attend in amongst a whole host of sensory distractions. They can take themselves away, kind of resettle, gather their thoughts, find their sense of place, regulate as they feel they need to, and then attend to the learning task at hand.
I think one of the interesting things about flexibility is, of course, that it gives us possibility. You know, it's right there in the definition. But we sometimes forget that limitless flexibility and choice is actually overwhelming for everyone, you know, including adults. The more different flavors there are of free jam being handed out as samples in the supermarket, actually, the less likely you are to buy one of those, because it's overwhelming for us. There's a lot out there in our environment, and the same applies to our young people. So possibility is exciting, but predictability is reassuring. So we often forget in classroom spaces or in learning spaces that a mixture of flexibility and predictability can be most reassuring for our learners, particularly younger learners and particularly learners with neurodiversity and a range of other needs. So you might consider things like, yes, the furniture in your learning space is reconfigurable. That's awesome. That gives a whole bunch of flexible possibilities, but you might have certain settings that always stay the same. Or you might have, you know, resources and activities and all sorts of things that move around the space, but you might have some particular books or activities that will always be accessible and in the same space.
I guess overall our environment is very attractive to most learners coming in. And if students are feeling quite overwhelmed, you know, in terms of their sensory needs, we've got 2 breakout rooms, and we can obviously try and manage their needs by taking them in there individually. Some students don't like the light on or whatever that happens to be, so that's sort of more, you know, where we can, you know, change their environment to suit their needs.
And some students, at certain times, particularly our anxious students, may need quite a really enclosed space where the sensory input can be really well controlled by people. And in hindsight, having spaces that were a little bit smaller or a little bit more adaptable, just to meet that student need when it arises, would be great.
If we also have the size of a breakout space appropriately appointed for flexibility, then if we've got some kids with additional requirements and they happen to have a piece of mobility equipment, a wheelchair or a walker, or, you know, they just consume a bit more space for whatever reason, it means that we can support that their needs are catered for.
One of the things in our new base school design we've been really clear about is the need to have good sized classrooms, and I think an old-fashioned Kiwi classroom is probably about 70 square metres, and when we've looked at an ideal kind of space, we're not really prepared to create classrooms that are smaller than that. And that's often because kids with additional needs require more space around them for that kind of, to make sense of their world, for their sensory and emotional regulation. They often have more people around them, learning assistants or therapists that support them. Kids with physical disabilities often come with pieces of equipment that need to be easily accessed and need to be moved in and out of. And so thinking through the space that's required for a student who might have a wheelchair and a walking frame and a walker, they might have some physio equipment, and all of that needs to be used within the class environment, not taking them off to a back room where that kind of program is done separately and exclusively. So one of the things we've been really considerate about in our school design is creating classrooms and central spaces that are big enough for the equipment to be used as part of the learning program, as a support to the access to learning, as opposed to a separate kind of therapy that happens in a back room away from others. Look, I think in terms of what needs to be present, we've really thought about just the size of the learning space probably is our number one priority. Having space allows us to be flexible for the kinds of learners that might be in our school. One of the things in a specialist school environment is we can't always predict who will be in your school 10 years from now, but having space allows us to flexibly respond to whoever it is that might arrive at your doorstep and what they might need to be able to support their learning.
So if we think a decade ago, gender diversity, neurodiversity, they just weren't the same top of mind that they are now. And our awareness of more types of varieties of diversity will continue to grow. There'll be types of diversity that we can't contemplate now that will be completely top of mind to consider in 3 years, 5 years. We don't know what they are. So what means we need to concentrate on being proactively ready for diverse learners before they come to us. So if we take gender diversity, for example, a school might not have actually given much consideration to gender diversity if they don't have, and they haven't had, any students who are openly on a journey of exploring their own gender diversity. But the stats tell us they're going to have learners who will go on that journey. And so if those spaces can proactively nurture ākonga diversity, then those ākonga can feel safe and supported to be and to learn as their authentic selves, whatever that looks like.
The relationship between indoor learning spaces and outdoor learning spaces, and this is probably true of all the learners that might come to a school, but for students with additional needs, often outdoor learning spaces are used to help students regulate themselves and their emotions. And so having a place where students can safely be outside and have movement breaks, where they can jump and swing and run in a safe way, where without having to have an adult very close next to them, where they can explore the environment, is another consideration in terms of being inclusive in our learning design.
I would just say when it comes to the environment, the sensory environment is really critical, and I think it's probably it's one of those softer qualities around an environment that people don't necessarily pay that much attention to. I know that there's DQLS standards around acoustics, but that's at one point in time. It's around how does that play out when you've got a lot of activity, when you've got a hearing impairment coupled with a vision, less than good, way of processing, and delays with, how you respond to information from, a kind of an auditory processing perspective. So all of that can be highly impactful to enabling great learner performance.
Thinking around how we use the environment to cue in the kind of learning that students might need to do within a classroom. colours and spaces and textures and light can all help us make sense of the expectations of us, and thinking about young people who may have autism and their need to go into a space that has a lower sensory input, that might cue in quiet activities versus spaces that might have more space or light or sound that might cue in fact, more active learning. And using the environment to cue in the kinds of expectations of learning is one of the ways that we can help students with additional needs manage the structures and routines of their day that support their learning. One of the other things around access is also a consideration for students who might have visual or hearing issues, thinking about good acoustics so that we can manage peripheral sound, how we use glass considerately in learning environments so that it reduces distraction or glare for kids who might have cortical visual impairment, or who are using devices such as AAC devices where glare off screens make eye pointing or other kind of access a little bit more challenging. And so just thinking through how we might move around the building and how the building can support students' sensory access in terms of their vision and hearing impairment, probably quite important.
So just something to consider if you are doing a new build, and just in light of the fact that we've had 2 students start in our school in the last year who have got low vision. They have found it very difficult to navigate around our environment. Well, not very difficult, but they've found it difficult, and it would have been easier, I think, for their transition if we had clear contrast around the corridors in terms of the traffic, the main corridors of use. So, for example, in the learning areas or learning zones and the main traffic corridors, the floor coverings are the same, and that's not, I don't believe, useful to some of the students with low vision. And I guess you never know from year to year who you are going to have, so it's that whole, pitching to the outliers. It would be, I think, beneficial to get LENZ to perhaps, if that's a possibility, to have a look at what you're proposing to do to just make sure that those needs are taken into account.
So some of our classrooms, we will create spaces that are small and cosy, places where an individual student might engage in the kind of activity that is quiet and calm and maybe on their own or with their learning assistant. Then some of our spaces will, with both furniture and in the environment, be more of a social space. Perhaps the tables and the setup allow more children to be around, and the queuing is that this is a place where children might need to work with and alongside each other. Thinking about our junior spaces and our play-based learning environments, we've used tables and furniture to be able to indicate the kind of play that is expected in each zone. And of course, outdoor learning is a big part of that, because that's where our big play and our movement breaks might happen, which might be different to the space we create in a room that's a little bit more about solitary, focused, quiet activities.
So what we have got is some high-backed sofas. So the sofa would be, if I was sitting down, it would be above my head. And we have 4 of those, 2 facing each other with a table in the middle, and another 2 facing each other with a table, sort of like a booth at a diner. And students can work in there. It provides a sense of belonging and inclusion in the space, but a little bit of just, this is my space, and students there would often be 2, maybe 3 students working in there together. They could be working on the same thing or separate things, but it helps provide a slightly separate space inside of a bigger space, which helps a lot of our students. The other piece of furniture that we have that I think works really well is we have 2 very big, 2 large round tables with rounded sofas going around half the sofa. This is at the edge of sort of the corridor and where our learning space starts. And students are really drawn to and attracted to these. They're just a nice place to sit at. They also work really well in terms of being able to see what students are doing and accessing them to give them support. It's very easy for the staff to move around and see what's going on, either in front of them or behind. And they are attractive to other students as well. We get them at lunchtimes wanting to come and sit there. And we do also have some more traditional furniture as well, with just classic tables and chairs.
Probably the greatest consideration for designing for inclusive spaces is something as simple as access and thinking through how students are going to enter and move around classrooms and school environments. Many students who have additional needs may be cautiously mobile. They might be wheelchair users, and thinking through how they might arrive at school if they are dropped off by parents or taxis, or have to use a total mobility vehicle, and how that might need to move between teaching and learning spaces is an important consideration.
We've been so lucky to have a universal design bathroom. We've had a student who particularly has needed a large space because we've had to put a hoist in there and add various other pieces of equipment so that they are able to use that space effectively. One of the things though, just as an afterthought, is thinking whether if you're designing a universal design bathroom, not to have it open onto a main thoroughfare area, maybe an entrance that sort of goes in from the side, so that students not feeling like they're on show if they're coming out of that environment, or concerned that someone might come in while they're otherwise occupied. So just some thoughts around that might be thoughtful or might be useful for your planning.
And I think also the placement of where things are inside the universal toilet. So one of our bathrooms, there's sitting on the toilet, then the sanitary disposal unit is too far away from the toilet. So you have to actually stand up and move there. And if you have mobility issues, that creates a whole nother level of challenge. So just thinking through the actual practicalities of those finishing touches makes a big difference to the users.
If you design well and you design optimally from the start, then it's going to be great for all. And so therefore the environment, by virtue of its design, is inclusive. And that's, for me, the gold standard.